Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here and to follow Vibeka's excellent overview of biosimilars. It truly is, as Joel said, a brave new world, and that's also a quote from Shakespeare from The Tempest. Shakespeare has really predicted this entire field. I'm going to talk about possible hurdles in acceptance and uptake of biosimilars in the United States marketplace from the point of view of society, the provider, and payer concerns. These are my conflict of interest disclosures, clinical trials that we're conducting, and consultancies. And I'm going to talk first about the societal benefit of biosimilars, and then talk a little bit, or actually I cut out the part about biomimics since Vibeka covered that. I'll talk about barriers to acceptance of biosimilars, both educational gaps or knowledge gaps and financial barriers. And then I'll make some comments about tendering in Norway, which is a wonderful example of how competition has fostered price reduction, and then some comments about pricing of biosimilars in the United States, and then talk about some disparate topics which lead to hurdles in the uptake of biosimilars, extrapolation of indications, substitution, and then some comments about pharmacovigilance and pragmatic trials. So this is Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the Leviathan in the 17th century after Shakespeare. At that time, Hobbes, as a philosopher of government, felt that society did not look out for the individual, or government did not look out for the individual, and the individual had to look out for himself. Women were disenfranchised at that time. And Hobbes, if he were living today, would say, why should I accept a biosimilar when I can obtain the reference product? And that's a typical comment that you might hear from a patient, because they're getting the brand name drug, they know the brand name drug, it's tried and true, it has years of clinical experience. Why should they accept something different? And the answer to Hobbes came a century later during the Enlightenment, where the Enlightenment philosophy of the social contract, as espoused here by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Rousseau would respond to Hobbes by saying we should accept a lower cost biosimilar so that medications are more widely available to all members of society. And I could probably have replaced Rousseau with Bernie Sanders, although he's no longer in the race. But the societal benefit of biosimilars, when I've said this at the ACR meeting last year, I was accused of sounding like Bernie Sanders, in that the potential risk to the individual of switching to a lower cost biosimilar should be outweighed by the potential benefit to society of expanding access to care for all. So it's really this social altruism that allows an individual to take something which might have slightly greater risk to benefit other members of society. So the potential benefits of biosimilars are that the availability of lower priced biosimilars, if they're truly lower priced, should decrease the cost of treating patients. If they're not lower priced, then this advantage is not holding true. Biosimilars should be more readily available to patients for whom the biooriginator has been inaccessible. Individuals who have a 20% co-payment or who have no prescription drug insurance would find a lower cost biosimilar to be more accessible, perhaps, than the biooriginator. And finally, greater global access, as Vibeka pointed out, with patients in Eastern Europe now able to receive biopharmaceuticals, greater global access to effective biosimilars should reduce disability, morbidity, and mortality associated with inflammatory diseases. So there is great potential benefit to patients and society if biosimilars are priced lower and made more accessible to patients. Now, what about barriers to acceptance and uptake of biosimilars? I've divided this into educational or knowledge gaps, which is really where the lack of information or misunderstandings limit the willingness of patients, providers, and payers to accept biosimilars, and then financial limitations. So barriers to acceptance and uptake of biosimilars in terms of knowledge or education gaps are that a lot of providers, a lot of patients do not understand what biosimilars are and what biosimilars are not. This concept of biomimics, which is a term that Vibeka and several of us coined to describe what previously had been called intended copies. Biomimics are the knockoffs of the drugs that you see in Colombia and India. These are biopharmaceuticals that are intended to be replicas of the reference product, but have not undergone full regulatory review by a regulatory body that has a defined pathway for evaluation of biosimilars. There's even a rituximab presumed biosimilar in Argentina, which didn't undergo any clinical trials. It was approved by the Argentinian regulators according to their pathway, but without any clinical trials. So that probably would be considered to be a biomimic, since even though it was approved according to that pathway, it didn't fulfill the regulatory requirements. So biomimics scare patients and scare physicians. You know, is the drug that I'm getting really the same drug as the product that the patient had been receiving? Misunderstanding of the regulatory review and approval process, or lack of understanding of the regulatory review and approval process, also intimidates individuals about biosimilars. When you read the regulatory guidance and understand how carefully these drugs are compared to one another, the biosimilar to the reference product, the understanding of the efficacy and safety of the biosimilar compared to the reference product is as great or greater than understanding how the lots of the reference product today compare to the initial lots of the reference product, although within the manufacturing process, this quality control is maintained. But there is a lot of information available comparing the biosimilar to the reference product at the time of approval. Long-term real-world efficacy and safety data, however, are lacking because the biosimilar studies are abbreviated, and initially at the time of approval, these data are not necessarily available. However, long-term studies are carried out as part of the post-marketing commitment, and long-term immunogenicity data are part of that. Extrapolation of indications is another knowledge gap, because here you're assuming that you can use a biosimilar in a disease in which it's not been studied. However, this extensive comparability exercise that Vibeke so elegantly described shows that the biosimilar, once approved, is essentially the same molecule as another lot of the reference product. And we have a tremendous amount of clinical experience, not only randomized controlled clinical trials, but also years of marketing experience showing that the reference product is effective and safe in each of the indications for which it's been approved. And knowing that the biosimilar is essentially like another lot of the reference product allows us to extrapolate indications. But until you become comfortable with that concept, it is certainly a barrier to accepting biosimilars. And then finally, the issue of interchangeability is scary. Patients find that generic small molecule drugs, where the chemical is identical, the binders, the different delivery systems may not achieve the same level of efficacy. And with a biopharmaceutical where one cannot make an exact copy, patients and providers are also worried about the possibility that their drug might not be dispensed as written and might be substituted by a pharmacist. The financial barriers to acceptance and uptake of biosimilars, the first is that even though biosimilars should be less expensive than the reference product, in the United States, Zarxio was launched at 15% lower than the reference product Neupogen, and in the Wall Street Journal last week, it was announced that Pfizer plans to market Inflectra at a 15% cost lower than that of Remicade. The reference product price increases towards the end of the lifespan. I'll talk about this momentarily. There are discounts and ex-post rebates on the reference product, which make it difficult to really understand what the cost is of the reference product compared to the biosimilar. And then finally, the J-code issue is another barrier to acceptance. So the ideal biosimilar, if one looks at the absolute biosimilar, if one could, the absolute perfect biosimilar would be identical to the reference product. And in that case, if there are no differences in terms of structure, clinical efficacy, or clinical safety, then the only differentiating feature between the biosimilar and the reference product would be cost. So cost is incredibly important in looking at the potential advantage of a biosimilar. The CMS published these statements in 2015, and they talk about how the biosimilars should be viewed as an opportunity to save money. The states and managed care organizations should encourage use of drug utilization and cost management tools so that one uses a less expensive medication. Here they suggest that states encourage the use of biosimilars, and finally that these organizations educate providers about biosimilars. So CMS is favorably inclined towards the use of biosimilars and has encouraged their uptake. So there's a monograph that was published by IMS Health in March of this year, and in it they say that the market's best place to benefit from the biosimilars opportunity are those with a functioning competitive market where manufacturers are motivated to participate and where physicians are at the heart of the decision-making process. And these two markets are exemplified by the Scandinavian countries of Norway and Denmark. And in Norway, the hospitals are publicly run, and these publicly run hospitals have a tendering system. And so every year, the Norwegian Drug Procurement Cooperation, which is called LIS, procures all medications that are administered in hospital, intravenous medications other than for intravenous solutions and radiographic contrast agents, which are bid for every other year. But there are annual bids that are put out for each of the hospital administered drugs. So infliximab is a drug that's infused in the hospital, and it undergoes this tender process. So this tender system ensures that the prices that are offered by manufacturers to the government-run hospitals for patent-protected medications are lower than the prices that are offered for distribution through wholesalers or pharmacies, and this leads to a savings of about 15% of the total pharmaceutical expenditures in the country. So cost is a key driving factor as long as drugs in a given class have similar efficacy and safety. And with biosimilars, since it's essentially the same drug, then cost is the driving factor. So this is a system that introduces competition into the price of medication. So in 2014, the first year that the biosimilar infliximab was available, Janssen bid Remicade at 84,787 Norwegian kroner, which is the equivalent of about 14,000 US dollars. Pfizer, or at that time Hospira, came in with a bid for 9,500 US dollars, a 30% discount compared to Remicade. And Remsima Celltrion came in with a bid of $8,600, which was 39% lower. So the lowest price won, and that year all of the hospitals used Remsima for new starts. The Norwegian government gave a dispensation saying that patients who had been on Remicade could continue on Remicade, but all new starts had to go on the lowest priced medication. So here, competition drove the use of the biosimilar. In 2015, there was a 69% price reduction for Remsima compared to Remicade, and Remsima continued to be used as the infliximab in Norway. So this is a slide that I got from Tori Kveen, and you can see here the use of Remicade in Norway, and here in March of 2015, the two lines crossed and there was a marked uptake in the use of Remsima. So in Norway, where you have a competitive market with bidding that is driven by the government, there's a tremendous uptake of the biosimilar and a marked decrease in that of the reference product. When you look at the European Economic Area, which is all of the EU countries as well as Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and one other country that I'm forgetting, you can see here that this is Remicade in yellow. These are the other TNF inhibitors, and there's only a very slight uptake in the use of the biosimilar. So where there is not a strong competitive drive for the use of the biosimilar, there is much less uptake. So cost truly drives the use of the biosimilar, and competition drives price reduction. So in this IMS Health monograph, they said that the key to achieving potential savings lies in ensuring that payers adopt policies that enable optimization of the biologics market by encouraging sustainable competition. And this sustainable competition is necessary for the success and survival of biosimilars. So the Wall Street Journal in September, when Novartis, September of 2015, I think I put the wrong year on this slide. Novartis began selling a copy of Neupogen, and they did it at a 15% discount to the original. And then October 17th of this year, about a week ago, there was an announcement by Pfizer, which was described in the Wall Street Journal as a launch where they planned a 15% discount. And according to Michael Weinstein from JP Morgan, he said that Inflectra's 15% discount should provide enough of an incentive to help attract new patients to start on Inflectra, but probably won't be enough of a discount to entice stable patients to switch over. So this is an analyst's opinion. And according to this article, Johnson & Johnson says the average price paid for Remicade after discounts, so ex-post rebates and discounts, is 30% less than the list price. So if you've got a 15% discount for the biosimilar and a 30% discount for the reference product, clearly the reference product is less expensive. And nearly half of commercially insured patients don't have a copay under their medical benefits. J&J says it provides assistance that reduces the out-of-pocket cost of an infusion to no more than $5. So it goes on to say health insurers have complained that drug companies have weakened the potential cost savings from biosimilar competition by raising the list prices of the original brands far above the 15 to 30% discounted list price expected for biosimilars. So the discounting of the reference product is certainly advantageous to the reference product manufacturer for maintaining market share, but is going to go against the potential success of biosimilars. So in the Wall Street Journal on May 5th of this year, there was an article that was very interesting and got some attention in other press. And it talked about the patent expiry of Humira. And according to the Wall Street Journal, the main patent on Humira expires on December 31st, 2016. For those of you that are not intimately involved in this area, there are many different patents that regulate the manufacture of biopharmaceuticals, and to try to find out the date of patent expiry is nearly impossible. When I was writing a review with Morton Scheinberg back in 2011 about biosimilars for Nature Review's Rheumatology, I thought that I could call up each company and ask them when their patent expired, and then I could put together a table. And I called up and said, we'll check with our legal department, and I got the same response from every company: sorry, we can't tell you that information. Someone at Wharton got information through an intelligence service, and we published those patent expiries dates in that review article. But there's so many patents on each biosimilar, or I'm sorry, on each reference biopharmaceutical, that it's impossible to know when exactly the patent expires, and that's why patent litigation is so successful. Since 2013, AbbVie has increased the list price of Humira 8 times, by 73% to nearly $50,000 for 1 year's treatment. However, the average annual cost of Humira after discounts was $27,665 in the fourth quarter of 2015, which is 56% of the list price. And what the article said was, by the time a biosimilar for Humira goes on sale, it will probably cost well above what Humira charged before its cost began rising rapidly. So this is a graph from that article, and you can see that between 2013 and 2016, there was a steeper rise in the price of Humira as the potential entry of Amgen's biosimilar adalimumab comes close in 2018. So with discounts and ex-post rebates, the reference product manufacturer may reduce the price through discounts and ex-post rebates to lower than the biosimilar price to increase use of the medication or purchasing of the medication. If the payer designates the lower priced reference product as being preferred over the biosimilar, then competition is stifled. So initially that reference product comes in at a lower price. But if the biosimilar manufacturer cannot gain market share and withdraws from the market, then there's no longer competition, and the reference product price likely will rise. And as a result, in order to prevent this from happening, if the reference product manufacturer is able to reduce the price to lower than the biosimilar price for every biosimilar, then no biosimilar would be taken up by any insurance plan. the biosimilar manufacturers, especially the pure play biosimilar manufacturers, would go out of business. The other larger companies that are manufacturing both reference products and also biosimilars would probably drop their biosimilar franchises, and we would be left without a biosimilar market in the United States. So the payers may actually need to purchase the biosimilar at a slightly higher acquisition price to preserve a competitive market, because without a competitive market, the price of biopharmaceuticals likely will rise to the point where they become unaffordable for some patients or many patients. So what are the processes that are presently in place to try to regulate the use of biopharmaceuticals? As all of us practicing rheumatologists know, whenever you prescribe a biopharmaceutical for a patient, you have to get prior authorization. So no longer can we make a therapeutic decision for our patient based upon our evaluation of the patient and of the medication and the data surrounding the medication, but we have to go to the insurance provider and ask them what will they allow the patient to purchase. They're never going to tell us, no, the patient cannot take the medication that you're prescribing, but they'll tell the patient that they'll have to pay for it out of pocket. So patients typically will accept the medication that is provided with the lowest copayment. So payers use these processes to allocate limited funds for expensive therapies, which is very reasonable, because if they didn't exercise some limitation, then they would become bankrupt. The payer has no control over choice of the medication otherwise, and the payer does not consume the medication. So the free market principle of supply and demand and price regulation doesn't hold here. So the payer uses these processes to deny or delay the access for certain patients to treatment if the payer decides the treatment costs outweigh likely benefits. This delay is very effective, because with the cost of these medications, they save thousands of dollars every month that they slow down the approval of a biopharmaceutical, but patients are adversely affected. For providers, the negative plays here. The lack of choice may negatively impact a provider's ability to ensure that a patient receives needed care, and the additional paperwork uses practice resources that could be directed elsewhere. In our practice, we have virtually a full-time person who deals with all of the prior authorizations and other paperwork. The availability of lower-cost biosimilars would provide advantages. For the payer, greater competition in the market should result in price reductions, which would result in direct savings for the payer. And spending then could be redirected toward expanded patient access to the same medication or to other innovative medications, and provide more patients with greater access to effective therapies. For providers, it would facilitate the choice of the most appropriate treatment for the patient if we didn't have to deal with a third party overseeing our decision, and it also has the potential to improve treatment outcomes. Another issue which will be a hurdle to the uptake of biosimilars in the current situation is that of the buy and bill reimbursement model for physician-administered medications under Medicare Part B. This impacts infliximab. It doesn't impact the self-administered biopharmaceuticals. But during the first 6 months after launch, CMS reimburses the physician-administered medication at 106% of the wholesale acquisition cost, which does not include rebates or discounts. After that, they have the average sales price, which includes rebates and discounts, and reimburses at 106% of that. A J code is a code that is issued by CMS with which you bill for these medications, and there's a single J code for each reference product. Now with biosimilars, that same J code right now will apply to the biosimilars. So for Remicade and Inflectra, it'll be the same J code. Once there are more biosimilars of a given reference product out there, that same J code, unless policy changes, will apply. And the J code is issued 6 to 21 months after the launch of a medication. So there's a delay in the J code issuance, and the average sales price for each biosimilar is a blended rate, which is based on a volume-weighted price for all biosimilars of that reference product. So there no longer is going to be any price competition in the biosimilar market, because the reimbursement for the biosimilar is going to be the average of all biosimilars and the reference product. So it does not incentivize the use of individual lower cost biosimilars. So this single J code really takes out of play the price competition for biosimilars. So CMS is considering requiring unique J codes for all biosimilars, but since they are issued 6 to 21 months after the launch, there's going to be a delay in the uptake of biosimilars based on a cost advantage. So potential payer incentives to encourage biosimilar use would be to give biosimilars preferred formulary status, to have minimal or no requirement perhaps for prior authorization. So if a rheumatologist prescribes a biosimilar for a patient with a disease for which that biosimilar is indicated, if there were no paperwork that was required, most practices would probably lean towards prescribing the biosimilar. Putting these medications on tier 1 with the lowest copayment for patients, or perhaps even waiving the copayment, would also be a way of incentivizing the patient. So if you had a drug, a biopharmaceutical with known efficacy for the reference product, where there was no prior authorization and there was no copayment for the patient, that would probably be the first medication that was prescribed. So getting away from cost and talking about some of the hot button issues related to biosimilars, extrapolation of indications. Vibeke mentioned about extrapolation of indications, and this means that you can extrapolate data from a clinical trial of a biosimilar conducted in one disease to support approval for additional indications for which the reference product is already licensed. And this is really the efficiency of developing a biosimilar, because if a biosimilar were required to be studied in each indication, the cost of development would be multiplied 3 to 6-fold for drugs that are indicated for inflammatory diseases. The clinical trial for a biosimilar is really a bioassay to show that once all of the analytical identity and pharmacokinetic equivalence and toxicologic identity or equivalence have been proven, that when administered to patients with a disease in which the reference product is known to work, the effect is as expected. So the question comes up with extrapolation of indications. In which inflammatory disease should a biosimilar be studied to provide adequate information for extrapolation of indications? As a rheumatologist, if the studies are done in rheumatoid arthritis or ankylosing spondylitis, as for CTP13, or in psoriatic arthritis or juvenile inflammatory arthritis, I'd probably be comfortable, and most rheumatologists would feel comfortable going between these different diseases given our experience. However, would a dermatologist be comfortable if the drug was studied in rheumatoid arthritis using the drug for psoriasis? Or would a gastroenterologist be comfortable using it in Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis? Certainly Brian Fagan in Canada initially was not. And when Canada reviewed these medications, Health Canada was the first regulatory body to not extrapolate to all indications and did not extrapolate to inflammatory bowel disease indications. In Japan, approval was not extrapolated to ankylosing spondylitis, psoriatic arthritis, and plaque psoriasis because of patent issues. So Health Canada, in their initial document and their summary basis of decision in 2014, said that extrapolation of data from the settings of rheumatoid arthritis and AS to adult and pediatric inflammatory bowel diseases was not recommended. This arose from observed differences in the level of afucosylation, Fc gamma 3A receptor binding, and some in vitro antibody-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity assays. And these were issues that were discussed in detail at the FDA hearings where a different outcome was arrived upon. And the chemistry and manufacturing review team concluded that differences in the ability of the two products to induce ADCC could not be ruled out. So Health Canada did not approve extrapolation to those indications. However, the summary decision last year, extrapolation is supported based on previously submitted clinical studies taken together with newly submitted physicochemical and biological data and rationales addressing the roles of various potential mechanisms of action and relationships to clinical outcomes in inflammatory bowel disease allowed them to grant extrapolation to those indications. And with the clinical studies that they had available at that time, they extrapolated, as did all the other regulators, to all indications. So now, The only indication to which CTP13 has not been extrapolated is ankylosing spondylitis in Japan, and that's based on patent issues. So switching to legislation, there is legislation in the United States that has been passed in 35 states, or filed, at least filed, passed in 23 states and filed in 7. And this legislation governs substitution of biosimilars for reference products. However, there is no interchangeable biosimilar, so this legislation is essentially a moot point until the FDA approves of biosimilars being interchangeable. So typical features of the legislation are that any biological product under consideration for substitution must first be approved as interchangeable by the FDA, and Dr. Woodcock will speak after me, and I look forward to hearing comments about interchangeability guidance. Prescriber would be able to prevent substitution by stating dispense is written or brand medically necessary, and there are notification requirements where the prescriber must be notified of any allowable substitution made at a pharmacy, or if a substitution or switch has been made, and in some states there would be a requirement for patient consent before a switch. There has to be documentation where the pharmacist and prescriber have to retain records of substituted biological medications, which would facilitate a registry such as Corrona being able to track these substitutions, and the state must maintain a public or web-based list of permissible interchangeable products. Legislation in some states also requires the pharmacist to explain cost or price of reference biologic and interchangeable biosimilar to the patient, and provides immunity to pharmacists who make a substitution in compliance with state law. So the regulations differ in the different states, but this is essentially a summary of the legislation from all the states. Switching now to pharmacovigilance. Post-marketing safety monitoring is important to ensure safety and effectiveness of all biopharmaceuticals, including biosimilars. This is motherhood and apple pie, and we all know why pharmacovigilance is necessary, but it requires a system of nomenclature to distinguish the biosimilar from the reference product. And the FDA issued guidance about non-proprietary naming of biological products to improve pharmacovigilance and to differentiate among biological products that have not been determined to be interchangeable. And Vibeke mentioned that there are 3 suffixes that have been applied to drugs that we use: DYOIB for infliximab, SZZS for etanercept, and ATTO for adalimumab. These are suffixes that are supposed to be devoid of meaning. They're also difficult to remember, although ATTO is the word for act in Italian operas, so that's the only one that's easy to remember. And the naming convention is applicable both to previously licensed and newly licensed pharmaceuticals, so I expect that infliximab Remicade will get a suffix when Pfizer releases infliximab DYYB. So the risk management plan and mitigation strategy should include participation in registries and educational material for patients and/or treating physicians. So this is directly relevant to what Corona does. How can we study these biosimilars? In the United States, there are fewer and fewer patients who are available for clinical trials, same in Western Europe. And so pragmatic trials that are conducted in clinical practice might be a very effective way by which to study new biosimilar agents. In this situation, participants in the trial are similar to patients who receive the intervention as part of usual care. They could be randomized from within an existing registry or recruited from practices, and the intervention is delivered as in usual care, and monitoring and intensity of management, or of measurement rather, are as in usual care. So one would extract the outcomes either from the electronic health record or from a registry database. So if Corona were to expand to the complexities of performing randomized trials within the registry, this is something that could be done within Corona, but certainly an alternative would be to do it in the context of clinical practice. My last slide is about the evaluation of biosimilars in Corona disease-specific registries. As has been pointed out, Corona has registries for each of the disease entities for which extrapolation of indications is granted other than the pediatric indications, and it collects detailed real-world observational data from both physicians and patients about clinical outcomes, pharmacovigilance, and then economic measures, which are incredibly important to understanding biosimilars. And it would capture data from patients switching between products in a real-world setting, reasons for switching as well as outcomes. So my slide, I guess I was not completely truthful. I have two slides. This is a slide that I used when I had to pinch hit for Jeff Siegel in 2010, giving a talk about biosimilars at the Targeted Therapies meeting. And I prepared that talk only having known that biosimilars were biopharmaceuticals that were similar to the reference product. And as a clinician, I framed 4 concerns that I had, which are, will a biosimilar be as effective as the originally licensed biopharmaceutical? Will it be as safe as the originally licensed biopharmaceutical? If a pharmacist were to substitute a biosimilar for a prescribed biopharmaceutical, will the patient be adversely affected? And will the availability of biosimilars reduce the high cost of targeted biological therapies for our patients? And back in 2010, I didn't have answers to these questions. But now my responses would be, if a biosimilar is approved according to a regulatory pathway for biosimilars, it should be as effective and as safe as the reference product. The designation of interchangeability is unlikely to be granted in the near future, not only because we don't yet have guidance as to what the requirements are for interchangeability, but what is the incentive to a manufacturer to develop an interchangeable drug? 1 year of market exclusivity is the first biosimilar to come to market as being interchangeable, and the delay in enrollment of a trial that involves the uncertainty of switching will be much more costly than a trial that doesn't involve switching. Insurance carriers and pharmacy benefit management companies likely will incentivize switching even without interchangeability designation between the biooriginator and the biosimilar and between 2 biosimilars. So by following real-world experience in a registry such as Corona, we'll learn about the safety and efficacy implications of switching. So we need real-world observational data on biosimilars, especially regarding these outcomes of switching. And finally, biosimilars should foster competition in the biopharmaceutical market, but those currently marketed in the US are priced only 15% lower than their reference products, and the reference products are discounted, so it's not clear that this pricing will truly foster competition. So with that, I thank you for your attention.